who's ever writing it is may have a thorny issue when it comes. And there are tens of thousands, nobody knows how many, but there are tens of thousands of leaseholds on reserves around the country. And they're used for residential properties, they're used for commercial properties like shopping centers. They're used for industrial developments in some cases. They're used for lots of different purposes. So there's a interesting variety of property rights on reserves, but they all have a serious shortcoming. Customary rights can't be enforced in court. Certificates of possession can only be sold to members of the same band. Leases can be sold to anybody, but they are temporary, and that creates problems around renewal. So what's the problem here? The problem is that the property rights structure on Indian reserves is very inefficient economically and is one of the most important underlying causes of the poverty of the people who live on reserves. I mean, think about it. You've got a lot of potentially valuable land. I mean, think of the potential value of the Tsutsina Reserve, for example. It's worth billions if it could be utilized. I mean, some of it is virtually central city now. And then it goes out to nice vacation-style property out towards Bragg Creek. Some of it runs along the Elbow River. Like, this is unbelievably valuable land. And yet you have people, I mean, not everybody is poor, but you've got a lot of poor people on the reserve. And even more interesting, you have a chronic housing shortage. There's no shortage of land. You know, you could put 500,000 people on the Tsutsina Reserve. But there is a chronic housing shortage. Why is that? Well, there's almost no private investment in housing because you can't build a house and use it as an investment vehicle. That's for reasons that I described. In practice, you do have a sort of communistic housing situation on the Tsutsina where the band, there's various government programs. They go to Rob, and Rob gives them money, and then they build houses, and then they assign people to live in them. It's like the old Soviet systems. Are the Tsutsina in your writing? No, none of them. Okay. Yeah. So the absence of private ownership. Well, actually, it's not just private individual ownership. Remember that the community doesn't own its land either. It's Crown land. So if you want some large-scale project, like the big development plan with the road, and the road is going to anchor lots of other developments, all that, very complicated rules for doing that. You'd have to designate land for leasing. It had to be approved by band referendum. It had to be approved by the minister. Negotiations went on for I can't remember how many years, certainly 20 or 30 years. Finally, it was defeated in a referendum. The defeat is probably due, I'm told, due to the Premier's office in Alberta. They wouldn't designate the land that they were supposed to give the band to compensate them for the land that they were going to surrender. And they got spooked at the last minute and decided, the majority decided to turn away from it. But it was the underlying cause of the failure was the complexity of the decision-making rules. So Indians on reserves are hampered as individuals when it comes to like having their own house, but they're also hampered as communities in trying to use their collective band land for major projects. Some get done. I mean, we know there are casinos, there are shopping centers and so forth. There are major projects on reserve, but they are expensive to do because of the transaction costs. You have to, since marketable property rights don't exist, you have to create them. That means bringing in a bunch of lawyers, sitting around the table, telling them to start running their meters, and drawing up the leasehold agreements that will make it possible to do business on a reserve. Typically, there's no infrastructure, so the agreements have to include provisions for who's going to provide electricity, who's going to provide water, who's going to build roads, and pick up the garbage, et cetera, all this stuff, which we kind of take for granted as part of the framework that we live in, but all that stuff has, typically on a reserve has to be created. So, what could be done about this? This has been, in my view, one of the most detrimental features for First Nations throughout their history ever since passage of the Indian Act, which in its present form was first passed in 1876, but it's actually based on older legislation, so it's even older than that. This is very deep-rooted in Canadian history. But I and my co-authors in this book believe that it could be changed. So what we've done in the book, the first part talks about some of the general considerations about property that I've just laid out for you. And the second part talks about the forms of private property that do exist on reserves now, the customary and certificates and leases. And then the third part is a proposal for improvement. We call that the First Nations Property Ownership Act.